Hello and welcome to the Bluefish Astrology YouTube channel. I'm Lily Walker, and today I'm here to talk about the full moon in Pisces that's happening on August 27th at 9:18 p.m. Pacific time. And this full moon is also a partial north node lunar eclipse. So we will be seeing the blood moon come out that night. But that being said, blood moon is somewhat ominous, right? But at the same time, I do think that this Pisces full moon will be a happy, a merry kind of vibe, and people will be in a good mood, but somewhat potentially internally focused and thinking about their dreams and aspirations and their visions. Because a Pisces full moon, as a mutable water sign, will slow us down to reflect and connect, and it awakens psycho-spiritual connections. So we see things in a different way, not using our rational intelligence, but using our intuition and our imagination and sort of those intuitive downloads that we get from God via synchronicities and symbols and divination and things like this that will be coming in strongly on the Pisces full moon. Although it is a kind of a good energy and a helpful full moon, at the same time it does have its edges. Really started noticing the edges of this full moon beginning to present on Saturday, when the sun made ingress into Virgo and we had a moon in Capricorn making opposition to Mars in Cancer. And boy, did I feel it tighten up the ship, right? You may have started feeling that too. With the sun coming in Virgo and that moon in Capricorn just really, ruled by Saturn, really wanting us to consider ways to tighten up the ship, to lean into discipline, to make some lists of self-improvements and ways we could optimize maybe our the vitality of our system. This is all very Virgo. But largely by doing this, by leaning into discipline on our own, we help out the Mars in Cancer, who's really struggling right now. And although he's making a square to Saturn with reception, and so, that's good for him, he's in fall in Cancer, and, and we'll talk about that some more later. But the bottom line is it's time to move the football. And with our projects with Saturn and Aries, and I don't think anyone's really feeling ready. So we'll get on to talking about that as well. But Mars in Cancer could use as much help as he could get, right? So the idea is, coming in Saturday, we started feeling into the Virgoan tendency to want to plan, to look into the details and kind of separate, and start to clean up and categorize the events and things that have transpired so far in 2026. Virgo is like the growing field, and it's the time in the wheel of the year where we begin to sort and package the harvest for shipping out and weighing. And it's right before a new school year where we'll start to get into that, right? So, I had kind of categorized Leo last time, and I used Cancer words to do it. But I really thought later that Leo is a lot like feeling like royals, kind of like walking around thinking about the new school year starting and who might be in your class, and kind of thinking about that in a way like you're going to be big man on campus, and sort of those sorts of can't buy me love sort of dreams starting to come in. But Virgo will start to take that to the next pitch, and less though with the daydreaming about being royals, but kind of thinking about, all right, what are my learning targets for the year, and what when I look at the harvest that I was able to produce this year and my growing process, what worked and what didn't, and where do I really need to make changes or optimize my machines and things like this, and maybe engage some new learning in order to grow the kind of crops I want to grow next year. So we also start planning what are we going to plant next year? And what are we looking to in the future? Maybe we'll cut some things out and not do those things in 2027. Maybe we planted too many varieties and we didn't get enough of one, and we see that we got a lot of this one and it's going to sell well. So let's grow more of that next year. These are the kind of things we begin to think about with the sun in Virgo. And Mercury is also in Virgo right now, which is really nice because Mercury is in domicile. And so he's just going to have been made that exterior conjunction to the sun prior to this full moon. However, at the time of the full moon, and also just knowing the situation of the world in general, I feel like those sort of details that we're looking for, which we would love to have things that have like are repeatable, like like that has precedent, it worked for them, that's a reliable method, let's use that approach, that sort of thing. We would like or tangible evidence that things are beginning to materialize, and so this plan of ours is going to work, because we can see the precursors or the foreshadowing of evidence beginning to show up tangibly. Although we would love to have that, um, and ultimately Virgo wants the facts because it wants to make good choices, right? And we would love to have that, but those sorts of details are a bit elusive right now and hard to come by. And so I think on this full moon, although we may have been racking our brain up to it in order to kind of come up with some details like that, on this full moon, it's really going to be letting go of that sort of analytical mind and leaning more into intuition and vision, because this is a full moon that's hooked on a feeling. Because in Pisces, we really are guided by our feelings. We know things by way of their energy. As the Neoplatonic philosophers talk about, like, we know things by way of their oasa, which I'm probably saying that wrong, but it basically translates to energy. So we know things by their energetic signature. Pisces blurs distinction between self and other, or distinction between objects, right? And it classifies things in a different way. And it does that based on a feeling of its energy or its auric field or its resonance. And so under a Pisces full moon, we will be guided to know things by way of their energy. And it's receiving those sort of symbolic divinatory downloads that help us know which way to go, because at this time Mars in Cancer is very much needing to move the football. So we'll get on to talking about that more. But at this point, only to notice that this is a full moon that's hooked on a feeling. Okay, so these downloads that we're receiving under the full moon in Pisces, with regard to which way to go and how to move this football forward in the projects that we're working on with Saturn retrograde in Aries, and that situation, they're largely going to be related to our hero character, or our solar character, not the smaller sense of self that relates to personality, which is very conditioned by experience and samsaric sort of experiences and traumas and things like this. Not this lower sense of self that's a personality, but the larger sense of self, like we talked about in the last video, that solar hero who came to be a world server. So it's largely going to be related to that because Jupiter in Leo was ruling this full moon. And we know that Jupiter in Leo is working very hard to help us build positive self-concept and confidence, and to help us learn how to express our creative heart truth again, and play and have that sort of joy of sharing and seeing and being seen and performing and all of these things that Leo loves to do, again in this world that has grown somewhat dark since 2020. And the South Node in Leo there is asking us to let go of things that are blocking our shine or getting in the way of our ability to share our creative heart truth. Potentially that could be self-criticism, or losing confidence, or different ways that things happen that make us doubt ourselves, or whatever it is that our art that we're sharing, or what we came to bring. So we're wanting to let go of that. And if we think about it, it's really letting go of points of pride, because pride can go in two directions that are extreme. it could go as far as being, having hubris and being overly prideful and like overly self-confident. To the other extreme, which is being like severely underconfident and not believing in ourselves and being shy and not being able to share things, or thinking, having a horrible self-concept and things like this. Both of these are extremes on the continuum of pride. And so, kind of trying to get into a middle way with that and express pride in a healthy and vital way that feeds the world around us and creates like reciprocity, because that's our heart, and the Leo is the sunlight. Right? So that is what feeds vitality to the mandala that arises around us. So, we want to have the right sort of kismet around that. And so, so Jupiter and Leo ruling this full moon will be bringing downloads and intuitive downloads related to our abilities and what we are actually able to bring. And it may surprise you with that changeability, and things that you previously thought weren't possible are suddenly seeming, well, maybe, more possible, and also potentially in the other direction. However, I think that largely that this full moon will be working to increase our self-confidence and pride, because Jupiter is making trine to Saturn retrograde in Aries. And so, as talked about in the previous video, those two met in 2020 in Aquarius. And at that time, Jupiter won that smackdown and he moved forward. And Saturn also has moved forward from Pisces now into Aries. But Saturn kind of went through a death transformation process and kind of poked his head out to be reborn again in Aries. And so he's the juvenile to the Jupiter. The Jupiter is the elder in this situation. And he has moved all the way up to Leo and is now looking backwards to make a trine at Saturn. And this will be reinforcing whatever Saturn's trying to build and do. And we'll get on to talking about Mars square there and how that's really coming down. At the same time that Jupiter's making trine to Saturn, like both of them are perfecting like within the course of a couple days, like in this upcoming week. And so the Jupiter looking back at Saturn is really reinforcing that we can do things, that we do have abilities if we only believe in ourselves and have confidence. I remember Lama Chonam, who is Sangye Khandro's partner, said at Losar, confidence comes from logic. And I thought that was so great, so maybe you'd want to think about that. Confidence comes from logic. And so under this full moon, the Jupiter trine Saturn will be supporting our confidence to move the football and accomplish what we are trying to build there with Saturn in Aries. So as alluded to previously, the full moon in Pisces is making a T-square to Uranus in Gemini. So as I talked about how, this moon is hooked on a feeling and it's about like intuition and kind of using that sort of right-brained way of thinking and classifying things, at the same time, it has the potential, that intuition has the potential to be quite loud. And that's because of Uranus and Gemini. And so, I remember that Jeff Austin, who was in Yonder Mountain String Band, sang this song where he wrote, and I believe he was talking to spirit, at least in, some way, had that higher understanding of, and he said, tell me anything, but tell me loud. And I always liked that because it's like, okay, God, right, tell me anything, but tell me loud so that I can hear you and I know which way to move and which way to go. And I think this full moon in Pisces will be like that. Although whatever messages we're receiving may not be the most comfortable thing, after the week we've had leading up to it and sort of the year we've had, but especially this week, just having the message, I think, will be a great relief. And with irreversible faith and trusting God and moving the ball based on that message, I think we'll get good results. So, so Pluto and making the T square. So we have, that's two different squares going on. And so Uranus in Gemini, I've been talking about it as the hot mic, where it's like the in the communication wires, there's like this hot mic right now, and it could hear a pin drop. And you never know what thing that you put out there is gonna just go with feedback, right? Like things could get so loud. So we all have to be really careful with Uranus and Gemini around our communications and the things that we say or write or put in, on posts and things like this. But at the same time, it's really interesting because Mercury, who rules Gemini, is now in Virgo in domicile, where he's also the exaltation lord. And he's, of course, ruling the sun. And he's making a square to this Uranus and Gemini in his house. And so it's almost like when Uranus came into Gemini, and then when Mars made conjunction to Gemini, to Uranus in Gemini, and really planets haven't gotten a good angle on that yet. And Mercury in Virgo is really starting to see some of the tangible effects of that, though, as well. But at the same time, it's almost like we've been waiting to get an angle on it so that we can begin to manage what's been happening now that Uranus is in Gemini. Okay, and so it kind of came in there and stirred things up. If you remember, it was just after the Venus Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, and then Mercury was quickly coming up to make conjunction and kind of join that party. But then Uranus came in Gemini and he went retrograde in Cancer. Okay, so because it's like we needed to get our mind around what just happened, and that was his house, right? So now here he is in Virgo, okay, and he has strength and dignity there. And for all the reasons I spoke to, that the details are not really there right now, at the same time, Mercury's trying to get grounded, and to ground that live wire a little bit. So there's some tension there. And like I said, although we don't have tangible evidence yet, making a square of kind of conflict, with the moon, etc., just the Virgo energy and opposition, although we don't have that tangible evidence yet, we do have the ability to tighten up the ship and start making lists and start thinking about how to mind the gaps. Minding the gaps under this full moon is not a good idea, because if you mind the gaps, you'll get out of the flow state. But overall, as Mercury moves through this sign, we will want to work on self-improvement and Virgoan type topics. And we may talk about that more under the new moon. Okay. But that's the one square that's going on with this T square, is Mercury kind of finally getting a good eye of sight on what's happening in this house of Gemini. And then the other square is from the moon in Pisces to Uranus and Gemini. And that can always be a little bit of a maniacal or phantasmagoric sort of energy. Pisces square Jupiter square Gemini. It's really changeable. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland, and sort of this really weirdness that's very different. One thing about that, I can see us getting these intuitive downloads about this hero character that we came to be in this call that God's giving us, our mission from God, as the Blues Brothers would say. So I can see us getting this download, and then there's this square to Uranus and Gemini, which is a learning curve as well. So I think about Uranus and Gemini as a learning curve that's very quick. So and the idea that access to elementary education and ways to learn and teach ourselves things is unprecedented. Like, never under any time under the sun have we had more access and ability to learn things. So I can see the Pisces full moon sort of feeling into this hero character, and then the square there in Gemini being like, um, but no, I'm not capable of that. And the Saturn trine saying, yes, you are. And we're going to get on to talking about the Mars trine. Go ahead and move the football. You are capable of that. And then, but us thinking, well, I may need to undergo professional development or engage some kind of new learning, or I may need to approach this situation with beginner's mind. Uranus and Gemini being elementary learning, it's like it's rewriting the facts too of reality in a lot of ways. And we really do need to approach things with beginner's mind rather than approaching with a mind that was conditioned before 2020. Because the world has changed so significantly at this point, and what was no longer is. And as I've said previously, that we want to leave grievances at the door at 2020, because moving into this meta modern space is a whole new world. And so, just this idea of, can I do this, Lord? And God saying, yes, you can. And then seeing kind of the learning that we'll need to undergo in order to do that. Also, though, Uranus and Gemini changes situations. So with the ruler being in Virgo, our grounded situation, or the house where we have Virgo, things might change in shocking ways under this full moon. I do believe that the full moon will bring shocking communications, okay? Potentially related to resources, like Virgoan kind of resources. But nonetheless, situations could change drastically between Thursday and Monday. Okay. So we may have some changes coming in as well, as people lean into their call. So before I get on to talking about Mars, who is the triplicity ruler of this moon and sun, during this time, I first want to talk about Venus in Libra, who is the term ruler of the moon, which means she manages the fruition or the download that we receive. So largely, she is in domicile in Libra, which is really beautiful because she's valuing justice and balance and things like this and relationships. But she's going to move forward into Scorpio and then go retrograde and make a star point in Scorpio and then come back into Libra. So this process of coming back into a sense of justice and balance in relationships, which I feel got really knocked off kilter in 2023 with the South Node in Libra. This is going to be a process. It's not an overnight thing. But what's interesting about this Venus in Libra is that there's a more modern aspect, if you use 135 degrees, that connects the full moon in Pisces, Uranus, and the square with Uranus and Gemini to this Venus and Libra. So, what I just described that square as being is having this intuitive download about our abilities and to bring our note. We're going to bring it, right? Like how, and Mars is going to move that football. We're going to start to do this thing. But seeing kind of where we may need to engage some new learning and approach this with beginner's mind, no matter how great we are already at it, right? Because this is a new era and there are lots of new things to learn. And so that's square. But if we channel that in a lower vibe, it will pop off at the Venus and bust up our relationships. One way I could see this presenting is that feeling unfair, like, oh, but it's so unfair. I didn't have those opportunities to learn, so I can't do it, and start to blame somebody else or shift the blame, in these relationships. And so, that could be a danger. We know that with Saturn in Aries being at fall, he does exalt in Libra. So, because that's the opposite domicile, so that's his exaltation house, which is the strongest, like most favorite house. Domicile is very strong because that they own that house, but exaltation, you're like the exalted guest of that house and everybody loves having you there, so that's kind of nice, right? And so that's Saturn's house of exaltation, but Saturn is in Aries in opposition. So justice is not something that we have right now. The old laws don't apply anymore. We're kind of in this what is it, outlaw kind of maverick phase where old laws and old ways things used to go are no longer the rules anymore, because the Saturn kind of died and got bust up when that conjunction happened and the world fell apart, and we're in the process of building new rules and structures and containers. So so just warning against that square. Like, if what we want in our life is to keep the peace and our relationships under this full moon, and be the biggest sister in the room, right, which I think we all want to be, then we're going to want to guard against that square between the Pisces moon and Uranus and Gemini. And that can be polarity to comparative mindset, like it's the twins, so one got it and one didn't, and the one's feeling like, oh, that's so unfair, or this or that. So we want to guard against that under the full moon. Now, the other thing is that we'll go ahead now and talk about Mars in Cancer. So Mars in Cancer, as we talked about in the previous video, is a hard energy because Mars is also at fall in Cancer because he exalts in Capricorn, right? And as I talked about, when that moon came in Capricorn, opposing him, at fall where he's in exaltation, was really wanting us to tighten the ship so that we can help the Saturn in Aries and so that we can help that Mars, right? So, but Mars in Cancer, he really, he activates emotions. So we're like really engaged with our emotions. He also is acting to try to get comfortable in a lot of ways, but he's also instigating new relationships or instigating things within the family ties that bind. And I think that with the Mars in Cancer can sever. It overheats the emotions, yes, but also is a hot blade that can sever. So I imagine with the making the square to Saturn that we could see some severance of the family ties that bind, or else potentially instigating new ties that bind. The square to Saturn is really rough. So Mars in Cancer has reception to that square. So because Saturn is in his house. And so he's feeling very much like he needs to move and to make something happen in that house. But Saturn in Aries is really, he's at fall and he just doesn't have what he needs in order to pull things together, because as we know, Saturn needs earth or, something, even maybe some water and dirt to mish together to make a block to build or to pour some concrete. That's actually made out of water, bones that grow in the water, those like barnacle kind of guys, and then you mix it with water and it becomes concrete, right? So in different elements there are things that we may be able to extract to build with, or at least or some sort of tangible building material. But fire is not so much that way, right? Fire scorches the ground and burns things, and so it's the highest element of us going back up to source, but it's also the first element where source comes down. And all we have to build with right now is fire. And when I say that it's like pressure to get the steady square together, that's because the square and the number 4, boom, boom, represents the earth, or the ground, or the square that we stand on. It's the earth element coming together. Whereas 3 is like the triangle of spirit. At 4 we get a square and you could stand on it, right? And it's like a plane. And so Saturn's really working to get together that plane of reality that we can get 2 feet on the ground in this world, right? And build these structures. But we're not quite at that phase yet. But nonetheless, in this time period, we are needing to move forward, to move the football in some way, or feeling pressured to, at least in some way. And so Mars in Cancer, really heating up our emotions and our habitual tendencies and our ways of feeling bratty. Like, these are some lower expressions of it, right? But in the higher sense, it's really, asking us to, we could be hen housing, like being a mother hen and nurturing, and we could be overactive in that. But really, we want to be the perfect even keel of nurturing self and others and remembering what we learned with Jupiter and Cancer there. So, Mars making that square to Saturn, it may bring some endings, or it may finally bring a beginning in earnest. So speaking to that opposition between the sun and moon, right? So we've got a lovely, imaginal and visionary and mystical and transcendent sort of full moon happening conjunct Fomalhaut, which I'll tell the story of Fomalhaut in a bit. And then we have an opposition from the sun and Mercury in Virgo. And then in addition, we also actually have a yod between Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune in Aries, and pointing right at that sun in Virgo. And so it's really pointing at the sun in Virgo and our tendency to overthink and want pragmatic, rational details, and reminding us of the time period that we're in. With Pluto in Aquarius, also Pluto's making trine to Uranus in Gemini, which this moon is T-square to, which we'll get on to. But, Pluto in Aquarius is very much trying to work to transform the way that we connect, and the way, like, social connections, and also the way that, like, the interdependent connections, things that make up interdependent connections. And that's a Buddhist term. So those things can be subtle. It's like the butterfly wing flaps, and then, the consequences roll out, right? So it's looking to transform those interdependent connections so that way we can come into a connection in an up-leveled way. And it's really ultimately looking to build collectives and hubs, social collectives and hubs, artists, justice centers. They're trying to build a justice center at my work that they're calling a hub, and other little collectives like this of artists or astrologers or musicians or of bands even. We're building these sorts of collectives. So that's Pluto in Aquarius. I'm calling it the urge to rhizome the reed flutes. And then that is in a sextile position with Neptune in Aries, where we've received the baptism by both water and fire of this new sort of meta-modern understanding of religion and religious studies and philosophy, with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction back in February. But I'm calling that the baptism, that Saturn and Neptune and Aries conjunction, as a baptism by fire. But we were already baptized by water with Saturn and Neptune co-present in Pisces for as long as it was, and the Saturn and Venus and all of that. There was a baptism by water that came first, but this is a baptism by fire. Now I have two more things to talk about with regard to this full moon, and it's conjunct the magical fixed star that's the royal watcher of the south, Fomalhaut. And the other thing is that it's talk about the North Node a little bit, because it's a North Node eclipse. So the moon being conjunct Fomalhaut, he's the watcher of the south and also the mouth of the fish. And it's interesting to me because I don't always come on full moons, but I wanted to come on this one especially because of this aspect, because my channel, Bluefish Astrology, is actually dedicated under a talisman to Fomalhaut that was gifted to me by my friend Gary Caton. When I rebranded the channel, I didn't realize it till a few days later. But I realized that the connection to Fomalhaut, and I was like, wow, that is so cool, right? So I had the talisman for like 4 years. That was gifted to me, and you can see it. It's on the Buddha back there. And so the reason why I named the channel Bluefish is because I sort of have an obsession with Oannes, who is the Mesopotamian fish god who came to visit the good kings of Mesopotamia and reminded them of the knowledge that was buried beneath the two pillars of Solomon's temple. And so it's like this, he's the bringer of the perennial wisdom teachings, okay? And he's who reminded us of those things that we knew before the flood or the fall of Atlantis, or just the flood. And so I'm obsessed with that character, and it makes me laugh because, when I get back into reading books on Neoplatonism and these things, and I'm loving that these philosophers are going back to Empedocles and Parmenides and going back to the pre-Socratics like Pythagoras and saying, you know what, honestly, by Plato, something was already wrong. And I'm loving that, but it also amuses me because none of them are brave enough to tell the truth yet, which is that all of it goes back to a fish named Oannes. So, and that's actually the truth, right? Like, so it's, I find that really amusing and funny, but I can't see academics going there anytime soon. But in the esoteric world, we've been there for a long time. And so, in the Hermetic teachings. And so this moon, Fomalhaut, is the watcher of the South. And I learned in this book by Bernadette Brady right here called Fixed Stars, this story about Fomalhaut. And, I think that maybe the Disney movie Aladdin was based on it, because she talks about how it's about an outsider or an outcast that rises to challenge the status quo authority and ends up winning that quest by way of magical assistance because his quest is noble. Okay, and it's about winning the beloved, to like the hand of his princess or whatever. So in that movie Aladdin is a street rat and an outsider, and he meets the character Jasmine, and they meet like in a marketplace, and then he gets tricked in to going into that cave to find the genie lamp by the royal vizier who had a spell on the king, right? So this is a status quo reigning authority that has become corrupt. And in the end, Aladdin rises to challenge that authority, and he wins, right? And by winning, he not only wins the hand of his beloved and becomes king consort, he wins a table at a seat at the table of insiders, okay? And so in this way, an outsider becomes an insider. Now, this is really fascinating. Like, if you have read Henry Corbin, and because he talks about that, how almost the beginning stage of, where it starts to become problematic on the spiritual path is we find ourselves as an outsider because we have this realization about the blending of self and others, and kind of that sort of trip of how am I doing, whatever, that sort of trip. And we have this realization of this blending between self and others that actually begins to make us an outsider. And that the quest is to how do we get back inside and blend those two, coming back into union with the beloved. And so, so this, as the royal watcher of the South, this star Fomalhaut watches over noble outsiders who, when inspired by an encounter with divine Sophia, rise to challenge the status quo authority and win a seat at the table of insiders by becoming king consort to Sophia, right? Divine Sophia. So they're a different kind of king. They're a philosopher king, okay? And so I've been talking about the new philosopher king since 2020. You could go back and look on my channel. I think like 2019, I started talking about Jupiter as this new philosopher king. And here we have a full moon ruled by Fomalhaut, or not ruled, but conjunct Fomalhaut, ruled by Jupiter, the new philosopher king. And this promise in the story of magical assistance being granted to those who have a noble cause. So when we go back to that Jupiter trine Saturn, and Saturn saying, yes, you can. And Jupiter saying, yes, I can. In addition, God and the Watcher of the South are saying, yes, you can if your cause is noble. It's like, we're building these things by fire. And this is a new era and a new time period. And things that happened in the past are not the way it's going down now. And new philosopher kings have been given a mission from God, with Saturn and Aries. And yes, we can do it if we have irreversible faith, trust in God, and primal trust in God, right? So if we rely on our refuge and have irreversible faith, we can do it. And so we'll be receiving those synchronicities and symbolic downloads to let us know that's true on the Pisces full moon. In addition, the North Node in Aquarius is that's rebel rousing, avant-garde, revolutionary ideas and thoughts and communications and intelligence, right? And that help us to connect the dots in new and novel ways in order to get systems up and running. Okay, so the Aquarius is a tinkerer. It can be like a wizard, or it can tinker with machines, and it's alive, in Aquarius. So that's like that wizard vibe that can bring it to life. And we're receiving a ray of influx of astral energy into the mandala that has intelligence, that we will be able, that are coming into the collective consciousness and the akashic field around us that we can all connect to, that we'll be able to access, that will help us to get these systems up and running again that we're working with as well. So not only do we have Fomalhaut promising magical assistance, in a way we have the North Node raying in some of that as well in the form of intelligence and ideas. Okay, so I hope that has been helpful. Thanks again for being here, you guys, or thanks for being here and for watching this. Thanks for your patience with this video. I actually had to do about 10 takes, so in the least, I just wanted to say thank you for being here and the patience if it felt like it was multiple takes spliced together, because you're right, it is. And also to say that I got the Bluefish website up, and that so you can get a reading there, bluefishastrology.com, and that I've been taking a class with Oner Doser from Kepler, and it's been the greatest. And if you could take a class with him, you should, because it's like zone of proximal development. Like, he's really good, and boy, I like really helped me. But more, it was just brought me a lot of joy. And like we've learned how to find these 5 significators, and it's really different way to read a natal chart. And so, because what I do typically is more personal, and it can get into some pretty deep stuff, and not everybody wants to get that deep and personal about their, some of you guys are Jupiter Scorpio, right? You don't want to talk about that with me. And some of you guys, people just don't. I don't want to talk about that with another astrologer, to be real honest, unless I know them really well. And so this read is more about the external world. And it's like a financial indicator, a professional indicator, marriage significator, and children, the significator of children, and then just general significators. And what I find so interesting about it is how accurate it is. So I've been getting better. It was a huge steep learning curve in the beginning of the class. I didn't think I was going to be even able to get a grade in it. It was so hard. And I'm not bad at astrology. Like I've watching that South Node in Leo, but like I'm not bad. I'm actually pretty good at astrology, to be honest. I've read a lot of charts, and I've studied so much, but this was really hard because the medieval is hard. But I'm getting better at it, and I was closing that learning gap. And by the 3rd class, I was really able to keep up. And so as he was talking about the significator of our partner, right, like our marriage, by the time he got to where it was showing what the delineations were, I was like, wow, like one of my partners, like my closest thing to having been a marriage partner, my son's father, I'm surprised his picture didn't pop up when, you know, like with the definition. I was like, well, you just defined him, like spooky accurate. So, you know, there's that. And then the financial indicator, we're able to then put, you know, all of these things, we're able to then dial it out into transits, right? So that's your natal chart, but we can see when transits hit a financial significator. So I can tell you when you're going to make money or when you might lose money or this sort of thing. And you know, we can kind of look at it through that. So, but yeah, so I thought that would be something to look forward to. So thanks for being here, and let's see. I hope everybody has a happy full moon, and that you do receive insight and intuitive downloads. I would say if it were me, I would be alone. And you know, come 7 o'clock tomorrow night, I'd be getting quiet and maybe getting my crayons and my colored pencils out and my writing tablets, and I'd be journaling and thinking and praying and meditating, maybe dancing to songs. I don't know, doing things like that by myself in my room in order to get in touch with spirit so that I could hear those messages and, you know, as loudly as possible and as much, you know, get as much data as I could. So that would be my focus for the full moon. Okay, love you guys. Thanks again for being here. Bye.